Well, happy Wednesday to everybody. Hope everybody out there that's watching had a good holiday. And welcome to the November webinar. We're just about done with 2017. So, a couple of really important topics over these last couple months here. And I want to start with some observations I've made fairly recently, as in Wisconsin at least. If any of you are watching from out of state, but in Wisconsin we have gubernatorial election next year, and there are a slew of candidates that are going to be in the Democratic primary. I think we're at about 8 right now, and that number will probably increase. So it's going to be a large number of people with their hat in the ring for the Democratic primary, which means that there's a lot of opportunity to look at what they're saying, how they're communicating, are they talking about values, etc. And I will assume that it looks like everyone on here is familiar with the basic tenets of framing, so we can bypass that. And what I want to get into is, and that's a good point, strong progressives winning across the country. And one of the things that I've written about recently is this idea. Oh, thanks for the 11. Yeah, it's a big number. So with strong progressives winning across the country, one of the things I've written about is this idea that as the pendulum of extremism keeps moving further and further to the right, that since we're all hardwired for empathy, once things start violating that kind of very fundamental tenet that we are actually genetically inclined to for empathy starts being violated, the majority of people who are biconceptual will have a sense that something's amiss, and they will look elsewhere. So that could be something we're seeing. We also could be seeing opportunities for people to get engaged again after feeling kind of let down after the election, that there are opportunities to engage, and that's something that we can encourage. And I believe that when you talk about the idea of framing, that's the opportunity to engage people in a way that is deeper and far more effective and hits them at their core, so you can make an authentic connection. So basically what our topic du jour is so based on my observations of what candidates have said, kind of what's gone on around the country, there's a lot of attention now about messaging and about framing. And you hear a lot of people talk about communicating values and talking about what it means to be progressive or what it means to be a Democrat. And that's all well and good because it brings attention to the need for effective communication and what framing means to that. But I've seen a lot of mistakes, a lot of kind of fundamental mistakes that people are making. And so I kind of put together 3 critical do's of framing, because we want to keep it positive, what you should do to avoid common mistakes. And then I have really a fantastic example of really effective framing on a very current issue, which you're going to see once we get through this, how that same message, basically because of the values, can and should be used on any issue. And the point is that if you're involved in your local races, if you're involved with a particular candidate, when you go to the door to advocate for that person, or you are advocating for a specific issue, um, the necessity to make that connection quickly is more important now than ever, because people have a tendency to make a snap judgment based on very early things that you say. And those judgments are made very instinctively and very quickly, and you really don't have time to recover before either the door is left open and you can communicate with that person, or the door is shut in your face. So the best way to make that connection is at that values level, which obviously is something that I've been talking about for a long time, and so have a lot of people. So how do we do that effectively is the big question. So the first, I think this is the top uh, aspect of framing that we really need to be aware of. And there are some people that talk about framing, that kind of say that they're doing framing, but they don't consider a lot of these things. And this is a big one, because the default frame right now is conservative. And that goes for religion, it goes for politics, it goes for fundamental decisions that people make based on media and marketing and what you see on TV. So the default frame that the majority of people are operating in is conservative. And what do we know about frames? Well, obviously the more frame is repeated and reinforced, the stronger it gets. And it also suppresses the other frame, progressive, even more, so that becomes weaker. So that means that even in people who are progressive and very empathetic, that conservative frame is very active. And when we're talking about things that we care about, the most important thing is to consciously, and we'll get to this in a little bit here, evoke the progressive frame. Because the conservative frame will always be implied when you are having a conversation with people about policy, politics, and issues. And I have here the reasons for that. Many of you have been in workshops that I've done. Some of them I've gone into depth with this, and there are some videos and audio clips of some of these things. But in the 1930s, there was a coordinated campaign by conservative interests led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to push back against the New Deal, which FDR had a very moral messaging of the New Deal. So the U.S. Chamber hired this minister from Los Angeles, James Fifield, and they did a coordinated, basically, attack on the New Deal, and they succeeded in equating capitalism with Christianity. And the rest, as they say, is history, and we are still reaping the, kind of the consequences of their success today. So you had the this U.S. Chamber that was a very moral mission to equate Christianity and capitalism, which resulted in the Freedom Under God campaign, and that went on for decades. Through the 50s, very successful. That's the reason that our coinage and our currency says "In God We Trust." So it was very successful. In 1964, it was solidified even further during the Goldwater campaign, and I have there Ronald Reagan's "A Time for Choosing" speech, and that was broadcast in prime time all over the nation just before the election in 1964. And while Goldwater lost, the consequence of that loss was that conservatives solidified their message, they solidified their frame, and it became increasingly dominant in public discourse. And I would encourage you to watch Reagan's A Time for Choosing speech. All you have to do is you can go to YouTube or Google and type in Ronald Reagan, A Time for Choosing, and you can watch the full speech. And I would strongly suggest it because it is a lesson in how we got to where we are today. It's a lesson in fundamental conservative framing and what that sounds like and what it looks like, and it still is the same language is being used today very successfully. And it will help in recognizing those key phrases, those key ideas that evoke the conservative frame so that we can pivot and use progressive values and progressive ideas. So from 64, we move on to the Nixon campaign, his law and order message, that you had all these, you know, undisciplined women burning their bras and, you know, having sex all over the place, and the elite, the liberal elite classes in academia who were looking down their nose at the working people of this country, particularly working men, blue-collar men, who took a lunch pail to work and, you know, worked in a factory every day, and you had the liberal elite looking down their noses. And Nixon was going to teach them respect. He was going to discipline them. He was going to be the law and order president. I saw the war on drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So Nixon really solidified that with the Law and Order campaign. And really what we see today is that in not only in the media is that reinforced every day, because the media just repeat everything conservative Republicans say verbatim, but both political parties do it as well, because we often see Democrats repeating what conservative Republicans say, even in their attempt to negate it, to try to disprove it with facts. They're still repeating the frame. They're still repeating those ideas, which you've all heard me say 100 times. But it's important because this is something that goes back to the 1930s. So there's decades and decades of catch-up to do here. And the net result is that the conservative worldview is common sense. Unless, as I say in the final italics there, unless you consciously evoke the progressive frame, the conservative frame is implied. So, what does that mean for where we are right now? Well, there are a lot of people who talk about framing outside of that context of conservative framing being dominant and default. And that's a mistake, because as you're going to see transitioning to the next slide, words and language do not themselves have universal meaning. So what do I mean by that? So you read any press release or any statement on policy or any campaign speech from a Democrat, just pick one, anyone, and you're going to see all these popular buzzwords. Now, why are those buzzwords in there? The buzzwords are in there because they sat down a bunch of people in a focus group and they ran a bunch of statements by these people, and they pulled out particular words to see what people's reactions were. Now, that's all well and good. And conservatives started doing that way before progressives, or Republicans started doing it way before Democrats. And the difference is that conservative Republicans did it with framing in mind, knowing that they wanted the strongest reinforcement of their evoked frame and values as possible. So they were looking for people's responses to that frame, to affirm their belief, their worldview. When Democrats do that, they are looking for simply audience response to a word either positive or negative. There's no contextual consideration for the frame that's being evoked and the idea that's being reinforced. And the problem with that is, as Lakoff and others have proven over decades now, is that words do not have universal meaning. A word is not understood universally simply by it being read or heard. It is only understood in the context of a frame. That's a really good question. So the reason conservatives, let me get to the here. So the reason conservatives are good at this is basically, yeah, that's right. Like the hardworking families one is completely evocative of the conservative frame, because if you're not hardworking, you're not going to do well, and you deserve to not do well because you're just not working hard enough. Exactly. So no, the Republicans. You have to remember this was led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce originally, so these were all people that knew marketing. They knew the things that you know, corporations and publicists and people who study marketing, they know how to push people's buttons, they know what people respond to, and they knew that the language they were using would hit people at a very instinctive level. They weren't aware of the unconscious effect at that point, but because of their history and their track record in marketing and successfully getting products into consumers' hands, they knew that it would work. So it was really an aspect of kind of dumb luck, but it was more strategic in terms of using what they knew from marketing. So, and as anyone now who studies marketing can tell you, is that you learn about cognitive science. You learn about how to reach people, how to affect people at a very unconscious level. So, there we go. Good questions. So yes, words do not have. Yeah, they knew what worked. They didn't know the effect on people's unconscious. They didn't realize that these things would embed themselves physically in the brains, and they would consistently be reinforced. They didn't know that. But what they did know was that, hey, this works in marketing. It works, to get our products sales increases. So it's got to work with politics, and they were right. So, and the result of that is that all these. Yeah, right. I'm not sure at that point. 1930s, early 40s. I'm not sure. I have to look into that. But the consequence of this is that since words have meaning in the context of a frame, if the default frame is conservative, and you have all these contested words, I have a few of them listed there: freedom, opportunity, prosperity, investment. So you've got these contested words that mean different things in each frame. Then what frame are progressives evoking when they talk about opportunity and prosperity? Because if you recall, I had done a blog where I put the recent Scott Walker video up and played it, and he talks about investment in education. He talks about prosperity and building strong communities, and he talks about opportunity, and he means something very specific by that. So if a progressive comes around and just uses those same words, those contested words, in a very general statement about a policy issue, but then they talk about job creation uh, and that kind of thing. And some of them talk about not trusting government. What frame are you evoking and what frame are you reinforcing? So that is another aspect of framing and communication that really needs to be considered and adhered to. Words do not have universal meaning, and framing provides the necessary context for what you are trying to not only communicate to people about the things you care about, but to get them to care about it very deeply and instinctively, so that you can make a connection with them. Because we need to consciously communicate real empathy first, not sympathy, empathy. Caring for others as a moral responsibility to provide context for deeper understanding. So, again, if you don't do that, you are defaulting to the conservative frame. And that's happening a lot. And I think, hopefully after tonight, you start reading some of these things or asking questions and listening to responses, you'll start hearing and kind of hopefully being able to change how that's being communicated. So thirdly, I just have to digress to a little story here. So I had a conversation with somebody who's involved with one of the Democratic candidates running for governor. Take a quick drink of water here. Okay. So I was having a conversation with somebody connected with one of the Democratic candidates for governor in Wisconsin. And we were talking about kind of the idea of framing and some of the basics. And this person was pretty insistent that, look, if I just communicate about progressive issues, I evoke the progressive frame. And people will understand that I am a progressive, and therefore they'll know my values. And I said, that's really not how it works, because I can show you examples from your candidate, from other candidates, where they talk about, economic growth and how job creation is critical to economic growth, and that we have to empower the private sector to create jobs and grow the economy. And that is in no way evoking progressive values or communicating to people that you believe in progressive values and that progressive values underlie your policy positions. Because I could go to virtually any Republican politician anywhere in the country and show you a statement very similar to that. And so since conservative Republicans have had think tanks spending billions of dollars over the last 40 years coming up with those ideas and those metaphors and phrases, don't you think that what they're communicating is their frame, as opposed to you just kind of repeating it and trying to wordsmith it a little bit to make it sound like you're a Democrat, sound progressive? And we kind of agreed to disagree on that. However, I can pretty succinctly state that issue positions do not evoke progressive values. And here's a whole lot of reasons why. Well, not a whole, basically 6 reasons why. So the first one is, and this is a little sticky, is that issue communications often feed into socioeconomic hierarchies and the conservative frame. And what do I mean by that? So, inasmuch as there are huge socioeconomic inequities that need to be addressed, and we need policies to address them, the way to make them important in public discourse is not to say, I'm part of group X and we deserve Y because of these facts. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Right? That's not the way to bring people together to change public discourse about an important issue. Why? Because you are evoking a hierarchy of needs that you are placing your group's needs over everybody else. And you are feeding into that hierarchy, which is what the conservative frame is structured on. This authoritarian hierarchy, and it has socioeconomic aspects to it. So when you do that, when you focus on that type of a communication about an issue, it feeds into that hierarchy because you are saying that my needs are more important than anybody else. So that's first. Secondly, issue positions, especially from Democrats, often rely heavily on facts and not values. And what's wrong with facts? As we know, there's nothing wrong with facts. They are important. But if they do not fit the dominant frame or the frame that people are operating in, which again, default is conservative, then those facts will be ignored to preserve what fits their frame. And I've shown dozens of examples of this. You've all seen them, you've all experienced them in your life and in your life in politics and being involved in your communities. So that means that all that information that you are bringing up about the importance of income equality and social justice issues and things like that, if you're relying on facts, you are just preaching to the choir. You are not going to bring anybody else on board or motivate them to respond to what you're saying, especially if they are already operating in the conservative frame, which is, again, the vast majority of people. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So thirdly, all issue positions and every policy that you can think of derive from people's core values and beliefs, right? They were not just plucked out of thin air. They weren't derived randomly. Somebody didn't just open up a book and say, oh yeah, this. They come about because people believe in something as being morally just and morally correct. So that should be the very foundation of communicating about those issues. And that gets to the whole Simon Sinek thing you've all heard. That's the why, right? So all issue positions come from a why. The detail is the what and how. So that's important, to start with your why, start with the core values and beliefs behind the issues you care about. And the reason that's so important, those first three ideas there, is that because very frequently these values of empathy, based on empathy, are common and shared amongst most of the people. Most of the people in this country have the capacity for empathy. Sometimes it takes a natural disaster to bring it about, or a neighboring need, but people have the capacity for empathy. So if we start with that, start with how we care for others, how that's a responsibility, et cetera, we have the opportunity to activate them because they are currently recessive. So getting them active, getting people thinking in that frame again, right? And B, making some kind of a connection that transcends politics, values of us as humans, as people, who all want other people to care for us. So there's big opportunities there that are missed if you just focus on issues. So that's very important. And then I asked the question, why don't we discuss and lead with our empathy for everyone, and how we care for everyone, and how that's a responsibility, and how that makes us different from conservative Republicans. And then you can go through a laundry list of facts and issues that support that, once people are thinking in that frame. Because, and I've said this in several contexts, if you are thinking about caring for others and how that's a moral responsibility, you can't think of your own self-interest. Your brain won't let you because of mutual inhibition. So getting people to think about caring for others, even at the most basic level, inhibits them thinking about their own self-interest and the conservative frame. So, now granted, it can switch back very easily because it's dominant, but it is possible to evoke that idea and keep them there and strengthen it while you were having a discussion. So I promised example of effective progressive framing here, and since net neutrality is a big deal right now, and lots of people are focusing on action about net neutrality, and I may jump back and forth between a couple slides here. Just jump ahead to, I'm sure most of you have seen these before. These are nonpartisan progressive values these are largely based on the work I've done with George Lakoff and my listening and working with people over the past several years. These are ideas that even conservative Republicans at some level will agree on. With great freedom comes great responsibility. The definition of democracy and its succeeding when caring citizens act with empathy, not just in their own self-interest, as in democracy works when people don't just act selfishly, they actually care for others. Our private life and prosperity depends on the public. That's an easy one to demonstrate. And we'll go back to the net neutrality messages here in a second, and you'll see how that applies. And then I like this one because it breaks down the wall between people and their government. And that is the public, the government, all of us, and our elected officials have a moral responsibility to protect and empower the people they serve. And that's important. So you take those ideas, those are very core progressive values and beliefs based on empathy, and you apply them to messaging on an issue that is, kind of one that people will be like, oh, well, it's the internet. Okay, I've got access, and right, how bad can it get? And how do you get them to care about it? Well, there's a story here that we all developed and paid for the internet through the public, right? So we have this publicly funded resource that must remain fair and open. to benefit the people, right? So there you have a message that hits, I'm just going to jump back here, that hits the idea of freedom and responsibility, right? We developed this great resource so that people can be free to use it in a fair and open way. So that comes with great responsibility. And then the idea of democracy. Democracy empowered us to develop the internet. There's actually a specific one, private life and prosperity depends on the public. And then this responsibility to protect and empower the people they serve, right? We the people developed the internet through the public, so they have a moral responsibility. So then you get to the next message. Yes, and fairness, thank you. Yes, good point. All private profit, and there's nothing wrong with saying profit. Profit in and of itself is not bad. It does not evoke the conservative frame. It's contested. It depends on the context. So if you talk about private profit depending on public resources, it's like talking about profit creators, right? It says, look, the roads, the bridges, the internet, telecommunications, right? That all depends on public resources that we have developed. So we have a moral responsibility to never turn those over to private corporations. Why? Because the private corporation's moral mission, and for them it is a moral mission, is just profit. They have no moral responsibility like the public, which is to protect and empower people, right? So very important differences there in what profit looks like and why net neutrality is important to that. Again, the internet is a public resource. Absolutely. And then here's where you get that protect and empower thing and what freedom means in which frame. So, right, Republicans are trying to destroy our freedom and the internet as we know it. Right, which is true because they're trying to take away all of the above and turn it over to private corporations so that they alone can profit from it, right, and not protect and empower us. So stopping them from giving away control of our public internet to these private corporations is part of their moral responsibility to protect and empower the people. And if they don't do that, they're betraying our trust. So you see how all this can fit together in, some really good messages about net neutrality. And what's good about this is that this kind of a model can work on any issue. And, what I would challenge all of you to do and encourage you to do is to try and use this model, kind of evoking these ideas in messages like this, in, letters and campaign stuff that you do, and you can keep it very simple. Even portions of these statements can be used in the context of evoking the progressive frame in virtually any campaign context. So, and just looking to see if I've missed any questions. Oh, okay. So, and that's the other thing is that all three of these steps work together. You can't do one without the other. For example, you cannot understand that the default frame is conservative and ignore that words do not have universal meaning. And if words do not have universal meaning, that connects with the conservative frame being dominant, which also connects with the idea of issue positions not evoking progressive values. Because obviously, if language is not neutral, if words are not universal, then those issue positions and facts need to be framed. So, with that, if are there any other questions, or if anybody has any updates or news they want to share? Um, I So in the coming weeks, I will have a bit of an announcement of my own, in the context of the current gubernatorial race in Wisconsin. Um, but for right now, I'm going to keep it under wraps. But I will let all of you know, kind of what's going on before the year is out. So with that being said, thanks everybody for participating, and thanks for the questions and discussion. Um, okay, there's some questions coming in. Hold on a second. Yeah, that's a really good. So this problem that we're constantly using, right? So this is kind of like the Foxconn thing, right? So we're constantly using public resources and tax dollars to stimulate private business, right? Since that helps the economy and benefits others, but it doesn't. It only benefits a few people, right? So we have this public resources and tax dollars. Um, Going to, let's just use Foxconn as the example, and it's billions of dollars. I mean, Pleasant Prairie has opened up their checkbook, and they're getting land and infrastructure and tax credits and all this, right? So who does it benefit? It benefits a very, very small number of people. There are millions of people contributing to the success of that company, and only a few are going to benefit. And and I would argue that to not even have a discussion about jobs, because that is a very big if, and it's strictly hypothetical. The reality is that companies like Foxconn have a moral responsibility to protect and empower the people who create profit for them, which is all of us. See, I think that's the discussion that should be had, is challenging what the moral responsibility of the people who benefit is. Sorry. I did not quite get my participles right there. But yeah, that's absolutely true. Public, this whole, public resources for public good, the commons for the common good. Okay, those are becoming lost ideas. Right, and this whole idea of the purging of progressives from the DNC, there's this. So since the election, there has been a real circling of the wagons to keep the people who are in control. And I'm sure all of you have noticed it as well. And it's not only is it unhealthy, but it really hurts the democratic process, because what's happening is you're seeing like this whole third way Democrats kind of taking over, and it's contributing to the death of progressive ideas, is what it's doing. It's keeping the ideas moving further and further towards the right, which they claim to be the center, but it's not the center, it's the right. And progressive ideas are dying. You're right. And a comment about the growth is good paradigm, right? That's the Democratic message as well, from this like third way Democrats. Yeah. And yes, I am going to keep you hanging for a little while, so hang on. Yeah, the bailout was a progressive solution to the Great Depression. Yeah, it was a progressive solution. Um, in terms of, I'm going to turn on my camera. I just realized you're still staring at the the PowerPoint slide. Um, the bailout was a progressive solution in its idea, but in practice, I don't think it was a progressive in practice. I think in its idea it was originally, but I think it ended up not being progressive. So, but I think the idea was, yes, that we all need to contribute and help each other. And, I mean, FDR, hit it big in the New Deal. And so the bailout was almost kind of a light version of that really functionally only helped a few people. Of the Democratic governor candidates, are any of them being effective? Well, I would say yes. I think there are a couple of Democratic candidates that are doing a better job than the vast majority of communicating a progressive vision that is very different from what the Republicans now represent. So in that way, I think that there is some effectiveness going on. I think it could be better, but oh yeah, Gail, get your question in a second here. Yeah, so I think the framing is they're giving it a good effort, and I think it could be better. But I think at the very least, there are a couple candidates that are saying, here's what we can do more positively together for a better future, and here's what that would look like, as opposed to just the let's say how terrible and awful Scott Walker is and how he's friends with Donald Trump, so that makes him even worse. So yeah, I think there are a couple, and I think maybe in the December webinar I'll be more ready we can have a discussion about that. So yeah. That's kind of funny. Unlimited growth is the philosophy of the cancer cell. Well, and that's actually a really good analogy. It's an apt analogy because, right, the cancer cell sucks everything from the healthy cells and takes everything for itself. And I think that's a very apt analogy. And yes, so Gail, so private companies, right, so private companies have a moral obligation to protect and empower those who create profit for them, right? So let me just go back to that one slide here that might, right? So you have the public elected officials have a moral responsibility to protect and empower the people they serve, right? So you can translate that same message to how you message about for-profit corporations, that they have a moral obligation to protect and empower the people who create profit for them, right? Because without those people and without the public, all of us acting together as a public, that corporation would have no opportunity to make profit, right? They would have no roads, they would have no schools to educate people, they would have no internet, they would have no satellites, they would have no health research, et cetera, right? So, yeah, that's a good one. You are absolutely right. And maybe somebody knows when that was taken out of corporate charters. I think it was relatively recent, maybe in the 80s, 70s, 80s, possibly. I'm not sure. But yes, corporations used to be required to serve the public, and yes, and now that is not the case. Right, so the burning question, what do I think of Randy Bryce's messaging? Yeah. Well, yes, our Public Service Commission. And who's on the Public Service Commission? Let me think. Um, right. So, Randy Bryce. It's a mixed bag with Randy. Um, the one, and since we're closing in on the time here, um, I'll leave you with this food for thought about Rand. Yeah. Oh yes, no, good comment, Don. Not being, but supposed to have utilities for the public, but when right, so that the Public Service Commission is made up of people who serve the private entities, for-profit entities, instead of the public, then kind of get what we have now. So, good point. Thank you. So, to me, every fundraising email I get from Randy, and everything I see from him, um, I think he's very much a biconceptual. He has a very empathetic side, which he shows when he talks about his mom and his son. But yet, the dominant message I'm getting from him is that he's a better man than Paul Ryan. I mean, that's kind of boiling it down to its like fundamental message, but that's the message that I think people are getting from his campaign at the very unconscious, instinctive level. Is that you pardon my French, but it's kind of like a pissing match between two boys on the playground, right? Randy Bryce is saying you couldn't handle my job. I'm more of a man than you because I'm an iron worker. It's that kind of a thing, and I don't think that's effective at all. I think people are excited about it because he's kind of been built up to be this rock star, but then you have the identity over the substantive values that he represents, and that's a very dangerous thing and a very ineffective thing. And then you have this whole like I'm a bigger man than Paul Ryan kind of thing, which I think is completely evocative of the conservative frame, and so that's my 2 cents on that. But again, food for thought, and I think in closing, based on this great discussion, I think that December we should have a look at some of the kind of the high-profile campaigns here and see. Yeah, that's a really good right, but I think it even goes beyond the working class trying to connect with other labor. I think he's really trying to out macho Paul Ryan. I think he's trying to say, you know, we working blue collar working class guys are just better than him. We're just better than him, and we deserve to represent you more, and we'll represent you more. And I would feel better about it if I heard him, you know, talking about values. And I don't have my calendar in front of me, but I'll get it out to you soon, so that people can plan. Because the holidays are going to make things weird. So I'll get the date out soon, so everybody can plan. But it will be a Wednesday night, and let's plan on continuing this campaign because I think this is a good thread to continue. So great, good stuff. Thank you, everybody. This will be a good one for the internets. It'll be up probably sometime tomorrow. I'll get an email out, and everybody just have a great end of November, and see you sometime in September. Or just September. December. Okay, send Randy Bryce an email and say that he should take his shirt off. Good. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.